interested in studying only the immediate experience. अच्छा, क्या होता है कि एक्सपीरियंसेस तो हमारे बहुत सालों के हैं, हमें इतना पुराना एक्सपीरियंस नहीं चाहिए टू अंडरस्टैंड द बिहेवियर। हमें कोई ऐसा एक्सपीरियंस चाहिए जो बहुत रीसेंट रहा हो, बिकॉज दैट विल बी इमीडिएटली एसोसिएटेड विद आवर बिहेवियर। So Tishner used the method of introspection and self-observation, introspection और self observation. So introspection means हम जब अपने आप को समझ पाते हैं, हम जब अपने आप को पूरी तरह से इन डेप्थ तरह से अंडरस्टैंड करते हैं, interpret करते हैं. So observers were trained to describe the elements or the parts of their conscious experience of an object rather than simply naming the object. Means you can't, अगर जैसे मैं कहूँ ये पेन है, ये पेन, इस पेन के साथ मैंने अपना क्या एक्सपीरियंस फील किया इसको यूज करते वक्त, मेरे लिए ये सिर्फ एक ऑब्जेक्ट नहीं रह जाता, इट बिकम्स माई पोजेशन, इट बिकम्स माई बिलोंगिंग, इट एड्स ऑन टू माई एक्सपीरियंस. सो दैट विल बी अबाउट मोर माई इंट्रोस्पेक्शन कि मेरा इसके साथ कैसा एक्सपीरियंस रहा. सो टिश्नर ऑल्सो वार्न्ड अबाउट द स्टिमुलस एरर. जरूरी नहीं है कि हर कोई एक ही तरह से स्टिमुलस को समझे, हर किसी का उसी एक स्टिमुलस के साथ भी अलग अलग तरह से एक्सपीरियंस रह सकता है. सो द मेजर डीमेरिट ऑफ दिस अंडरस्टैंडिंग इज दैट देयर इज नो स्टैंडर्डाइज्ड वे ऑफ अंडरस्टैंडिंग. There is no standardized interpretation. It is very, very subjective because it can vary from person to person. And it is not very, reliable to test upon. कोई भी साइकोलॉजिकल टेस्ट में हम लिखते तो हैं इंट्रोस्पेक्टिव रिपोर्ट, लेकिन वो इतना ज्यादा सिग्निफिकेंट नहीं है जब हम टेस्ट को एडमिनिस्टर करते हैं. So according to him, an experiment should have certain characteristics like, it should be more frequent repetitions should be provided. Repetitions experiment में होंगे और जब रिजल्ट हर बार एक जैसा ही आएगा तभी उस एक्सपेरिमेंट का फायदा होगा. जैसे साइंस के जब हम एक्सपेरिमेंट्स करते हैं, केमिस्ट्री में एसिड्स के ऊपर, बेसिस के ऊपर जब हम एक्सपेरिमेंट्स करते हैं, हर बार वही चीज निकल के आती है. सेम वे इट शुड हैपन विद साइकोलॉजी एज पर टिश्नर कि जब भी हम एक्सपेरिमेंट करें नतीजा वही बार बार निकल के आना चाहिए. एंड द फोकस इज दस ऑन व्हाट इज रेलेवेंट and focus shifts away from what is irrelevant. So whenever we are conducting a study in psychology, our focus, our priority should be mostly on what is relevant, what is important in that conduction of the study as compared to what is irrelevant. And more widely, an observation is varied. More clear is experience of a particular stimuli. So more clear the experience, higher the chances of uncovering the laws. क्या होता है कि जितना हमारा एक्सपीरियंस अच्छा होगा, क्लियर होगा, कम से कम कंफ्यूजन्स होंगे एक्सपेरिमेंट को कंडक्ट करने में, उतना ही अच्छा हमारा रिजल्ट या स्टडी निकल के आता है. So Wundt was concerned with the objective and quantitative measurements. He explored how the elements of mental experiences are brought together or synthesized via apperception. Whereas Tishner focused on subjective and qualitative observations. अभी बहुत जरूरी डिफरेंस है. वुंट था वो बहुत ज्यादा ऑब्जेक्टिव था, बहुत ज्यादा साइंटिफिक था. He didn't cater to the subjectivity of individual differences as far as experience is concerned, as far as experiment is concerned. जबकि टिचनर बिल्कुल उल्टा था. He was inclined more towards the subjective understanding. When we are conducting a study, he emphasized more on personal experiences, which is the introspection. So Tishner's view of what psychology should study was rather limited, and he was only interested in studying the structure of mind. He was opposed to extending the horizons of psychology towards application. Means he was more about theoretically inclined, structure of mind को पढ़ना और बहुत ही लिमिटेड पर्सपेक्टिव से साइकोलॉजी को समझना. ही नेवर वांटेड टू एम्फसाइज मच ऑन व्हाट इज गोइंग टू बी द एप्लीकेशन ऑफ व्हाटएवर ही स्टडिंग. कोई भी अगर इंसान रिसर्च करता है, उस रिसर्च का बेनिफिट ज्यादातर तब होता है जब उसकी कोई यूटिलिटी है, उसकी कोई एप्लीकेशन है, आपने बहुत मेहनत से लैब में एक्सपेरिमेंट तो किया, लेकिन उस एक्सपेरिमेंट का एक रियल लाइफ सेटअप में कोई यूटिलिटी नहीं हुआ, तो उसका कम से कम फायदा होगा एक जनरल पॉपुलेशन को भी. सो सिमिलर demerit was with Titchener. Whatever he studied was more theoretically inclined and less of practical utility and less of applicability. So if we talk about the contributions, some contributions of structuralism are listed, and they are, it's defined, structuralists clearly define the subject matter. They use the introspective method, which was adopted by proponents of cognitive psychology. And, there were criticisms like it was too rigid, it was, having a very limited perspective, it was not adaptive, and, there was less of utility, less of applicability, and the method of introspection was very very confusing to be understood because there was no standard way of assessing introspection. अगर कोई अपना experience बताता है, उसका क्या जजमेंट दिया जाए, उसका क्या एनालिसिस किया जाए, किस तरह से उसको एनालाइज किया जाए, इस इन सब में बहुत ज्यादा लिमिटेशंस आए थे कि इंट्रोस्पेक्शन को एज अ वे ऑफ एनालाइजिंग अ पर्सन्स बिहेवियर कैसे अप्लाई किया जाए. So even Gestalt psychologists had pitched in and they criticized the structuralism part, and understanding the elements of consciousness doesn't suffice to understand the entire psyche or understand the entire human behavior. Consciousness समझना काफी नहीं है, वो किस तरह से बिहेवियर को इन्फ्लुएंस करता है वो भी समझना बहुत जरूरी था, and the study of Titchener and Bond was lacking it. देन वी कम टू फंक्शनलिज्म. फंक्शनलिज्म क्या है? अभी तक हमने पढ़ा था कि कॉन्शियसनेस होता है, स्टडी ऑफ माइंड होता है, इंट्रोस्पेक्शन होता है, इन सब के हम स्ट्रक्चर्स के हिसाब से को समझते हैं. लेकिन सिर्फ स्ट्रक्चर से काम नहीं चलता. अगर मैं ये कहूं कि ये पेन का कैप है, ये पेन की बॉडी है, ये पेन का निब है, इसके अंदर इंक है, ये तो सारा स्ट्रक्चर हो गया. लेकिन मैं क्या करूंगी इस स्ट्रक्चर का जब मैं इसको यूज ही नहीं कर पा रही. हाँ, अगर मैं कहूं कि पेन को कागज पे चलाकर देखते हैं, पेन से हम जो लिखना चाहें अपना रिटन एक्सप्रेशन कन्वे कर सकते हैं ऑन अ शीट ऑफ पेपर, दैट विल बी मोर ऑफ अ फंक्शनिंग पार्ट. कि पेन सिर्फ अलग अलग पार्ट्स का नहीं होता है, पेन लिखने के भी काम आता है. सो एक्चुअली फंक्शनलिज्म वाज वन लेवल अबव ऑफ स्ट्रक्चरलिज्म. स्ट्रक्चर तो हो गया कि एक ढांचा समझ जाना, तो उस ढांचे को तो आपने बना लिया, उसके आगे क्या? You need to utilize whatever components are there, so that will become the functionalism part. So functionalists were interested in studying the functions of consciousness rather than the structure of consciousness. They believed that mental functions were served as an important function in helping the organism to adapt to its environment. ये बहुत जरूरी लाइन है कि जब अलग अलग स्ट्रक्चर्स जो हैं माइंड के, कॉन्शियसनेस के, वो इकट्ठा काम करते हैं जिससे हम अपने लाइफ में अडेप्ट कर पाए, अपने एनवायरनमेंट में अपने आप को अडेप्ट कर पाए. That is the actual function of consciousness, and that is a very important point. So they strived to make psychology a practical science by expanding the areas of studies in psychology. And functionalists actually said that same organism, अब देखिए हमने स्ट्रक्चरलिज्म में एक्सपीरियंस की बात करी थी, है ना, इंट्रोस्पेक्शन की बात करी थी, लेकिन क्या होता है, मान लीजिए मैं या आप या कोई भी एक इंसान एक यूनिबॉल के जैसे पेन को यूज करता है. अब जरूरी नहीं है कि हर बार यही पेन मुझे एक बहुत अच्छा एक्सपीरियंस दे. Maybe it fell down somewhere, the nib got damaged and it writes very rough, there is not a smooth writing, ink quality has dried up because I'm using it after a long time. So each time I will use a pen or you will use something, you may have a different experience. The stimulus, like this pen, it could be the same, but your experience or my experience or anyone's experience could be very, very different. So this is what functionalists had emphasized on कि ठीक है स्ट्रक्चरलिस्ट ने एक्सपीरियंस के बारे में तो बात कर ली, लेकिन इस बात पर गौर नहीं फरमाया कि एक ही इंसान का हर बार अलग अलग एक्सपीरियंस हो सकता है. A person may have different set of emotions in the first experience as compared to second time when he experiences the same stimulus. Maybe once he is very happy, he is in a happy state of mind, he has a pleasant experience. Another time, maybe he is not in a good mood. The stimulus could be the same, but he didn't have a very pleasant experience. उसका अच्छा मन नहीं था उस दिन. So every time, even experiences could be very, very different and subjective, even if a single person is studied each time. So there were various antecedents of functionalism. First was Charles Darwin, and he influenced, the new movement of psychology, which is functionalism, and he explored the function that function does. What functions does the mind perform? कि ठीक है हमारे पास कॉन्शियसनेस है, कॉन्शियसनेस के एलिमेंट्स हैं, कंपोनेंट्स हैं, लेकिन उन सबका कंट्रीब्यूशन क्या है, क्या काम है उनका? That is the functionalism part. So Charles Darwin, he had contributed in psychology, and he was the one who had talked about survival of the fittest, and natural selection is the survival of the fittest. So we naturally, we are also getting naturally selected. देखिए जैसे कोविड में there were so many people who passed away and some had even survived. So those who were the fittest of all, they sailed through that phase very smoothly and they survived. So function same way Charles Darwin had also talked about the survival of the fittest, and functionalists had argued that certain behaviors and mental processes evolved because they served a specific adaptive function. So even to survive, you just can't survive physiologically. To survive and to be the fittest of all, you need to even survive mentally. The mental functioning also needs to get adapted as per the scenario to promote our survival, our maintenance, our growth. And Darwin's ideas also focused on pragmatism, which means the practical consequences. P for pragmatic, P for practical. Remember, pragmatism is about the practical consequence, the utility of, adapting. So Darwin's path-breaking work paved the way for development of comparative psychology, wherein the similarities in human and animal behavior were highlighted. कि जिस तरह से animals survive करने के लिए सब कुछ करते हैं, even humans can do that, because ultimately we are Homo sapiens and from animal kingdom, and we will somewhere show the similarity with other animals as far as surviving is concerned. And then came Francis Galton, focusing on the individual differences. Now, he also stated that we humans end up having, an extraordinary level of intelligence, and that extraordinary level of intelligence is called as eugenics, which is the science which deals with all the influences to improve the inborn qualities of a race. क्या होता है? You know, in humans, to survive, sometimes our body systems, they try to improve their way of functioning, so that even in the darkest situations we are able to survive and sail through. And when our inborn quality of improving our functioning for our survival starts functioning, that is called eugenics. And Francis Galton said that in many scenarios, our functioning improves its quality so that it helps us in surviving. Then came George Romanes and Conway Morgan, and he proposed the ladder of mental functioning, in which he ranked animals on their level of mental functioning. And in that case, humans come in the top-notch category because they have most complex way of cognitive functioning and mental processes. And he contributed to the development of comparative psychology, where humans were compared with animals as far as their psychological functioning was concerned. And he proposed the law of parsimony, where he stated that our behavior, the behavior in animals can be explained by lower mental processes as well. क्योंकि उनका cognitive functioning humans जैसा advanced नहीं है, so definitely they do have some level of cognitive functioning, but theirs is at the lower end. And then came Herbert Spencer, and in this theory, he talked about, in his theory as social Darwinism, Spencer applied the theory of evolution on all aspects of human life, including social institutions. He also coined the term survival of the fittest. And Spencer argued that all the mental processes are characteristically adaptive. So, whatever mental processes we are using, thinking, problem solving, attention, learning, memory, perception, all these mental processes also contribute in our survival, because once we start using these mental processes, we are able to sail through a situation and look for how we can best survive. So James had stated that psychology should study how people adapt to their environments, and it should not be what the just elements of consciousness. So elements of consciousness is fine, but it's very very basic thing to be understood. It's very primitive. Actually, why we should study psychology is so that we can understand how this consciousness helps in us to survive in our everyday life, in our environment. And James also agreed that physiology and psychology were going parallelly, which we have already understood once. And he stated that consciousness was continuous, and it could not be divided into segments merely for the purpose of analysis. So ये नहीं कि कॉन्शियसनेस के अलग अलग पार्ट्स बना दो और एक पार्ट एक काम करेगा, दूसरा पार्ट दूसरा काम करेगा. It cannot be segregated. It is a teamwork. Different parts need to be integrated and not segregated for the functioning of our consciousness. So James also, went against the idea that consciousness was static. Consciousness is never static. Why? When we talk about subjectivity, about experience, see, each time, even towards the same stimulus, our experience could be different. It could be very, very vivid. It could be very vast. So that is because, our consciousness is never static. Maybe as we grow, our understanding gets better. So our experience also gets better. And as the more the number of times we use something, maybe each time our experience changes. So consciousness is never at one place. It's never static कि जब भी मुझे experience होगा एक ही तरह का होगा. क्या पता एक ही चीज की तरफ अलग अलग तरह के हमारे experiences रहे. And we have to be adaptive about that vast scope of experience. And then comes the use of experimentation in psychological studies. And he did not use this method of experimentation much, and he recommended the use of comparative method. Comparative method may understanding human behavior versus animal behavior, that how animals adapt, how animals behave, how they survive, versus how we are showing our behavior to adapt. Another important thing what James had talked about is pragmatism. Pragmatism is about the practicality. कि अगर हम consciousness के बारे में पढ़ रहे हैं, how are we, using it as our strength, as a utility, and how it can be, applied in our everyday real life. And he also talked about the theory of emotions. जिसने भी मोटिवेशन इमोशन का चैप्टर पढ़ा होगा एनसीईआरटी में या फिर बीए में अभी तक, एक थ्योरी होती है जेम्स लैंड थ्योरी. तो ये वही जेम्स है जिसने ये जेम्स लैंड थ्योरी बनाई थी, जो विलियम जेम्स है. And the labeling of this arousal determines the felt emotion. And according to James, there are a lot of bodily changes that first come inside us before we are expressing our emotion. जैसे कि अगर गुस्सा आएगा, गुस्सा तो चेहरे पे बाद में दिखेगा, पहले एड्रेनलिन रश होगा. पहले वो सारे कॉर्टिकोस्टेरॉइड्स, कॉर्टिकोट्रोपिक हार्मोन, एसीटीएच, एड्रेनल, एपिनेफ्राइन और एपिनेफ्राइन, ये सारी चीजें चेंजेस आएंगे. बॉडी का टेम्परेचर थोड़ा रिलेटिवली बढ़ेगा, बहुत ज्यादा एनर्जी लेवल बढ़ेगा. ये पहले ही अंदर हो चुका है, बिफोर वी आर एक्सप्रेसिंग इट आउटसाइड एक्सप्लिसिटली. So, the physiological changes come beforehand as compared to the emotional changes in our behavior. And Carl Lange had also proposed a similar theory, and they both teamed up to make a James Lange theory to understand emotions. And James had also talked about free will, means he accepted that, um, showing understanding the free will, that why we do, we are, we have the freedom to express the way we want, whatever we want. Understanding that freedom to express was also emphasized by James. He explored the concept of self-esteem, and that was determined by the success and pretension. That मतलब जिसका self esteem high होगा, वो success, he will show success with a very, very, grounded expression of emotion, as compared to someone who is pretending, as compared to his success. Success is not so much as the pretension is. So James also wrote about the importance of instincts and habit, and he believed that too much of human behavior is determined by the instincts and the human habits. And according to James, instinctive behavior could be altered by experience. And as per him, these learned instinctual behaviors become habit, and they occur due to the repetition of actions. So, as per cognitive psychology, any overlearned behavior becomes a habit. And because of this, there are a lot of changes in our performance when we are showing our behavior. Please mute yourself. Then he also contributed in voluntary behavior, idiomotor theory of behavior, the mind-body debate, and his view was of what consciousness is, what the purpose serves, and he focused it, as a way of adapting to the everyday scenario. And then came Chicago School, in which Tishner had discussed that, psychology of structure or structural psychology and function of the functional psychology. So Chicago School had also, two prominent psychologists. One was John Dewey and another was James Angel. John Dewey was influenced by William James's naturalistic psychology, and he used the reflex arc. That is the connection between the sensory stimuli and its related motor response. So, actually, James had understood that reflex arc was understood to be a process involving a stimulus and a response. So if you know that if you touch anything hot, immediately you will move your hand. Or it could be the same case if you're touching something very, very cold, like an ice cube. Immediately you will move your hand, because too hot or too cold object will, definitely ruin our sensational, our sensory inputs, our sensory information, and we are the ones who can only function on homeostasis. So anything different, we will immediately show an emergency action, which is a reflex arc. So you can also make this diagram in your answers when you are talking about reflex arc. So, according to John Dewey, the behavior should be studied with respect to the function, especially adaptive function that it serves rather than structure alone. So, if we are studying about human behavior, just studying about the structure won't suffice. We must understand that how we are showing a behavior. Instead of just telling that, okay, this part of our consciousness makes us show this behavior. Why are we showing? How we are showing? Even that should be understood. So there were some major themes of psychology which came up. First is the functional psychology should be mental operations rather than the conscious elements. So functional psychology may we should be understanding more that how our consciousness elements operate instead of just understanding that the conscious elements exist as a part of our conscious as a part of our brain, and the study of how consciousness serves a functional purpose is known as a functional psychology. So consciousness is understood in terms of its usefulness as a mediator between the needs of an organism and the demands of its surroundings. So functional psychology is also the psychology of psychophysical interaction or mind body relationship. So how mind and body team up together to show a human behavior, that also is understood in functional psychology. And mind and body cannot be considered as separate entities, rather they are to be integrated when we are understanding the human behavior. So he agreed that the study of behavior should be the study of functions of the mental processes rather than the structures. Because once we understand the functions, the corresponding structures can also be simultaneously understood. Understanding the functions is a level above of just understanding the structure of the mind, that which structure of mind causes which behavior. Rather, we should even study that how that structure of mind is causing particular behavior, because uh, it's more advanced, and it also helps us to understand that how it can lead to our survival related functions. अगर हम कोई behavior दिखाते हैं, वो कैसे दिखाते हैं, वो क्यों दिखाते हैं, और वो हमारे survival में कैसे help कर सकता है. So Carr was of the opinion that giving the vast scope of functional psychology, these newer schools would have little to add to the subject of psychology, and proclaimed that functional psychology was American psychology. So Carr was another psychologist who considered that understanding of functionalism was more done by the American psychologists, and Carr explored how mental processes and behaviors served as a practical function and contributed to the survival of organism. And he talked about the adaptive functioning, and adaptive functioning comprises of the motive कि हम क्यों adapt करना चाहते हैं, क्योंकि हम मोटिवेटेड हैं अपने आप को एक नए एनवायरनमेंट में, नए सिनेरियो में एडजस्ट करने के लिए. मोर वी एडजस्ट, मोर वी सर्वाइव, बेटर वी सर्वाइव. सो वी हैव अ मोटिव टू अडेप्ट. सेकंड थिंग इज एनवायरनमेंट, कि हम अडेप्ट किसके लिए करें, टुवर्ड्स व्हाट शुड वी अडेप्ट. वी नीड टू अडेप्ट टुवर्ड्स द एनवायरनमेंट. सेकंड थिंग इज रिस्पॉन्स, एन एक्ट दैट रिजॉल्व्स द मोटिव, कि जब हम अडेप्ट करते हैं एक मोटिवेशन के साथ, हमारा क्या रिस्पॉन्स निकल के आता है एनवायरनमेंट की तरफ. Whether we fail to adapt or we are successful in adapting. Then comes the Columbia School. In Columbia School comes James Cattell, and Cattell was influenced by the work of Galton. And Cattell believed that the study of sensory and motor abilities would determine our intelligence. कि अगर हम अपने एबिलिटीज के बारे में समझते हैं, हम अलग अलग एबिलिटीज को यूज करते हैं अडेप्ट करने के लिए, तो इससे हमारा जो इंटेलिजेंस लेवल है वो समझ में आ सकता है कि कौन कितना इंटेलिजेंटली अपने एबिलिटी को यूटिलाइज कर रहा है अपने आप को एक नए एनवायरनमेंट में अडेप्ट करने के लिए. Then, according to Woodworth, if the subject matter of psychology was only the stimulus and an organism's response to it in a given environment, then psychology would omit the most important factor in the equation, that is, organism itself. He clarified that stimulus itself does not lead to a given response. मतलब stimulus अपने आप में काफी नहीं है response दिखाने के लिए. ये ऑर्गेनिज्म होता है जो स्टिमुलस की तरफ रिस्पॉन्स दिखाता है. अगर सिर्फ स्टिमुलस देते जाओ लेकिन स्टिमुलस को कोई समझ नहीं रहा, कोई कॉम्प्रिहेंड नहीं कर रहा, तो रिस्पॉन्स नहीं आएगा. इसी वजह से स्टिमुलस को काफी नहीं समझा गया है एक रिस्पॉन्स दिखाने के लिए. Woodward chose the study of stimulus organism response, ना कि सिर्फ स्टिमुलस रिस्पॉन्स, क्योंकि स्टिमुलस को इंटरप्रेट करने के लिए हमें एक ऑर्गेनिज्म की जरूरत होती है. तो स्टिमुलस के बाद ऑर्गेनिज्म, और एक ऑर्गेनिज्म ही एक रिस्पॉन्स दिखाता है स्टिमुलस के तरफ. So Woodward suggested the use of observational and experimental methods for the study of external behaviors. एक तो वुडवर्थ ने एक्सटर्नल बिहेवियर्स पे एम्फसाइज किया है कि एक एक्सटर्नल बिहेवियर ही समझा जा सकता है, ना कि एक इंटरनल बिहेवियर, बिकॉज एनी एक्सटर्नल बिहेवियर इज ऑब्जर्वेबल, साइंटिफिक, ऑब्जेक्टिव एंड मेजरेबल. So Woodworth was more inclined towards examining the physiological causes of behavior. His dynamic psychology wanted to study the above human behavior, the drove human behavior, and he explored the cause and effect relationship. And Woodworth even stated that the mechanism was triggered when a need presented itself. In the same situation at different times, the organism may respond differently based on its needs. And then came about Thorndike, and Thorndike had also conducted, experiments on animals, on cats, on rats, and he talked about the operant conditioning, and he talked about the trial and error. So Thorndike conducted a research on many topics, including learning, comparative psychology, intelligence, social phenomenon, and he used what he called the puzzle box to examine the trial and error learning. Puzzle box में क्या होता है कि एक एक स्क्वायर शेप्ड बॉक्स होता है, उसमें बार बार एक बटन को दबाया जाता है. जब भी वो बटन को दबाएंगे एक खाना बाहर आएगा निकल के, लेकिन ये देखना पड़ेगा जानवर को, कैट है या रैट है, दैट एवरी टाइम दैट बटन इज प्रेस्ड, that time the food is provided, but that is not learnt immediately because there are 2-3 buttons kept in that box of the Thorndike, the puzzle box. So they will be trying different buttons at which lever or button, if it's pressed, the food comes out. So each time the lever is pressed, they understand, okay, whether it's the food is coming out or not. So ट्रायल एंड एरर का मतलब ये है कि बार बार एक ही बिहेवियर को ट्राई करना पड़ता है और पता नहीं कब उसका एक कॉन्सिक्वेंस निकल के आए. So according to this law, behaviors that are followed by more rewarding outcomes are more likely to be repeated. अगर जब भी कोई कैट लेवर प्रेस करेगी और एकदम से उसको खाना बाहर उसके लिए आ जाएगा, वो ये सीख जाएगी कि जब भी मैं ये लेवर प्रेस करूंगी मुझे खाना मिल जाएगा. मतलब जब भी मुझे खाना खाना होगा, जब भी मुझे भूख लगेगी, आई मस्ट प्रेस द लेवर. इवेंचुअली विद वेरियस ट्रायल्स द एरर स्टार्ट्स रिड्यूसिंग, क्योंकि इतनी बार हमने एक्सपीरियंस किया है, हमने इतने अटेम्प्ट्स कर दिए हैं कि अब हमारे एरर्स की फ्रीक्वेंसी घटने लग गई है. सो behaviors that are followed by unpleasant outcomes are less likely to be repeated. अगर लेवर प्रेस करने पे उसको एक करंट लगता तो वो फिर ये बिहेवियर रिपीट ना करती. बिहेवियर करने पे उसको एक रिवॉर्ड मिला तो ये बिहेवियर रिपीट भी हुआ. So functionalism borrowed from the incorporated evolutionary theory into psychology. and it laid the groundwork for development of subjects like comparative psychology and evolutionary psychology. Functionalism focused on what was useful. From merely describing the structure of mental processes, functionalism shifted the focus of psychology to the purpose of mental processes and behaviors and its adaptive value. मतलब सिर्फ mental processes को समझना काफी नहीं था. Mental processes किस तरह से हमें सरवाइव करने में हेल्प करते हैं, हमें बेनिफिट करते हैं, वो भी समझना जरूरी था. And it studied all the aspects of human behavior, be it cognition, emotion, religious experiences, and it focused on, the development of other fields of psychology as well, like industrial psychology, educational psychology, organizational psychology. Applications और बहुत branches of psychology में हुए हैं. And functional psychology also incorporated the diverse populations, including infants, children, individuals with mental disabilities and other studies. So ये नहीं है कि एक ही तरह का सैंपल था फंक्शनलिज्म को अप्लाई करने के लिए. अलग अलग एज ग्रुप्स पे, अलग अलग तरह के लोगों पे, वेदर देवर एबल्ड और डिसेबल्ड, हर तरह के लोगों पे स्टडी किया गया था फंक्शनलिज्म के लिए. But it had definitely some limitations also. First is, it was always sounding a bit unclear. It was sounding a bit ambiguous, confusing to be understood. And the critics pointed out that functionalists use a concept first and defined it later. मतलब पहले concept को apply किया, पहले उसको दिखाया करके, उसके बाद में समझाया. So that was a demerit. And the functional psychology had always overemphasized on adapting instead of understanding that adapting is towards not just a simple situation but the complex life processes. So after functional, first comes structuralism, then comes functionalism, and now we talk about the Gestalt psychology. And this term is from the German language, which means the shape or the form, and it helps in emphasizing the understanding of mind and behavior, which is working in a very organized way. So Gestalt psychology believes that our mind and behavior doesn't work in a haphazard way. It works in a more organized way because we are inclined towards organizing the information and then comprehending it. We can't comprehend and register any information if it is provided to us in a haphazard or disorganized way. जितना भी डिसऑर्गेनाइज्ड हो, हमारी एक टेंडेंसी है कि एक डिसऑर्गेनाइज्ड को भी हम एक ऑर्गेनाइज तरह से समझेंगे, जिससे हम समझ भी पाए और रिटेन भी कर पाए उस इंफॉर्मेशन को. सो it was started by Immanuel Kant, and he had talked about perception was rather as an active process, and the mind had actually organized the sensory elements to uh, understand. The mind had actually organized the information or the sensory elements or the sensory information to comprehend it in a more organized way. Then even Brentano had talked about the idea in Gestalt psychology, and he suggested that subject matter of psychology should be the act of experimenting, and that the methods of the study in psychology should not be mechanistic as used by the structuralists. So structuralists were very, very, mechanistic. They used it in a very mechanical way, but understanding psychology in mechanical way, it doesn't suffice. We need to understand it from a subjective way as well, and not just a mechanical way. And then Ernst Mach had also said that perception of space, form, and time were independent of its constituent elements. So perception space form can be how you perceive a square to be a square irrespective of its size and color. अब अगर कोई हम चाहे छोटा स्क्वायर देखें, चाहे बड़ा स्क्वायर देखें, चाहे किसी भी रंग में स्क्वायर को देखें, लेकिन हमारा वो परसेप्शन स्क्वायर का ही होगा. वो rectangle, triangle, circle नहीं बन जाएगा. So irrespective of the size or color, square will be perceived as a square. So that makes our perception a bit more objective. Then, even Christian Ehrenfels gave the contribution, and he said that perception contains form qualities. So if you see a heart made with dots, you will notice the heart, not the individual dots. And that is about, our perception of completing an incomplete figure. So if we are making dotted circle, we will, actually it's not a circle. That's just a cluster of dots shaped like a circle. But even if it's not a circle, we are inclined to understand a complete information and not an incomplete information. So even if the dots which are shaped like a circle, they will be perceived as a circle and not as dots. We are inclined towards completing something incomplete as well, so that it makes our understanding easier. And then there are other Gestalt psychologists, and the famous one was Max Wertheimer, who gave and did a very important development in Gestalt psychology. He started with the idea that it's possible to perceive a motion when no motion actually occurs, and that was resulting in five phenomenon. Now, in five phenomenon, what happens? Suppose in a dark room, there is a dot, small bright dot you see in a dark room. Even if it's not moving, you will perceive it to move. That's about the perception. And he had also, uh, he also had conducted this experiment in which he was moving two lights simultaneously. Moving means spotting them simultaneously. And that made the observer feel as if the lights are moving, whereas there's nothing that is moving. So that was about the five phenomenon that Max Wertheimer had worked on. And then came the contribution of Kurt Kafka, and he dedicated his life to advancing the Gestalt psychology. He published the principles of Gestalt psychology, and that was meant to be a thorough and organized presentation of Gestalt psychology. Then came about Wolfgang Kohler, and he studied the behavior of chimpanzees, जो insight learning था. And he studied the contribution, his studies contributed extensively to the area of learning. He advocated the extension of Gestalt principles to other studies as well. Gestalt principles को उसने अलग अलग जगह और भी अप्लाई किया है, अलग अलग स्टडीज में भी इंटीग्रेट किया है. So if we talk about the Gestalt principles, we had studied them in perception as well. And they are the principles of proximity, continuity, similarity. I'm sure you must be, aware of all these principles because they were taught in the first or the second semester of BA. And then comes learning. So, it was studied that learning uh, in the apes by observing how they reach the desired object like banana, and it used various ways of learning like insight learning. So they were not tamed beforehand. It was a sudden way of solving a problem. It had the aha effect. And so it's not necessary that learning should always happen by conditioning or by taming. It can be a sudden change in behavior as well, just because problem has to be solved. So insight learning is the sudden realization of a solution to a given problem. So the solution is very, very spontaneous. अचानक से solution हमें पता चल जाता है. बहुत देर तक हमें solution पता नहीं चलेगा, लेकिन जब पता चलेगा वो अचानक से होगा, without any other training given to us. So in the insight learning of Sultan, the chimpanzee, when he had to, join the sticks to pull down the banana, No one had taught Sultan to join one stick with the other to increase the length of the stick and then, pull down the banana. That was sudden. A thirsty crow may, the story of thirsty crow, which you all have studied in childhood, the crow was not taught to put the pebbles and bring and raise the level of water and then drink it. So that was also an example of insight learning. So a lot of lot of solutions are not tried beforehand. A sudden solution is immediately thought of. And the solutions which are learned through insight learning, they are remembered for a longer period of time as compared to the learning which is done through conditioning. Because in conditioning, there is more scope of getting trained. Someone is using his problem solving to train you. Whereas in insight learning, you are not being trained beforehand. You are just looking for a sudden solution because it comes to the survival. And then comes memory. So the activity in the brain caused by a particular event is known as memory process. As the event ends, so does the activity in the brain. However, the traces of memory processes remain in the brain. This is known as memory trace. कि आपका event खत्म हो गया है, लेकिन उस event के बारे में आपको अभी भी याद है. If you want, you can, after a couple of days of completion of the event, you can recall, you can make some effort, and all the event, all this, the serial order of the event can be uh, produced by you once again. And that is the memory trace, the capability to remember once again. And let us, understand now what is productive thinking. And according to Max Wertheimer, learning and problem solving were fulfilling experiences for an individual. In other words, problem solving is itself internally reinforcing rather than externally reinforcing. So rote learning is related with extrinsic reinforcement. Rote learning मतलब रट्टा मारना. So एक external reinforcement है कि तुम रटो, your input should be equal to your output. Whatever you are getting in as the information, same should be produced by you, and to be produced, we will reinforce you. So Vardhman was of the opinion that we engage in problem solving because we are driven internally to solve it and not because we are rewarded externally. So even if we are trying to solve a problem, that is not because we want to be rewarded. Our intention is not a reward. Our intention is to solve the problem, to look for a solution. Our intention is the survival. So Vardhana's productive thinking is replete with the examples where creative and flexible approach to problem solving can be seen. Why creative and flexible? Because we are not limiting the learner to use only one technique to solve a problem. Now, chimpanzee was not told that use two sticks. He would have managed with one stick as well. He had the complete freedom. But he himself examined that one stick won't suffice, so I better use two sticks for a better grip. So there is no bounding when we are talking about problem solving and flexibility in insight learning. The learner is not bound to use only one technique to solve a problem. There is a lot of scope of divergent thinking and not just convergent thinking. So, it was also about objective and subjective reality that we had to talk about. And objective reality is something which is full of facts that the environment is giving us. The objective reality is about, staying in Delhi, working in Delhi, preparing for an exam. That is about objective reality. But, objective reality is also limited to the geographical environment. But the subjective reality is the perception that the brain creates. And that is not limited to the facts. That is about the perception. Then comes the concept of transposition, in which the Gestalt psychologists believed that rather than learning a particular response to a particular stimulus, organisms learn the relationship between the stimulus and the response. मतलब हम सिर्फ ये नहीं देखते कि इस स्टिमुलस का ये रिस्पॉन्स होना चाहिए. वी आर नॉट दैट रिजिड। हम बल्कि ये समझते हैं कि स्टिमुलस का क्या लिंक है रिस्पॉन्स से, बेल का सैलिवेशन से क्या लिंक है, and that link is the food, the conditioning. So we are not limited or fixated to just knowing the stimulus or just knowing the response. We have the freedom to relate the two, and that is a transposition. So Lewin's field theory talks about the life space, and life space is all the influence that acts on a person at a given time, and these influences are also called psychological facts, which exist in an individual's awareness at a given moment. These psychological facts include the internal events, the external events, the recollection of past experiences. Our life is made up of all this, whether our past experiences or our internal events means how we are feeling, what is going within us, what is our attitude, what are our emotions, and the external events are what is happening towards us by the environment, which we are not able to control. So Lewin stated that at a given moment only those facts are present in an individual's life that affect his influence and behavior. And Lewin termed this as a principle of contemporaneity. And Levin also worked on the field of motivation, stating that how the biological and the psychological requirements or the needs can, you know, create tension in us, which motivate us to diffuse the tension, to regain the balance. मतलब हमारे कुछ biological needs थे, जैसे भूख है, feeling of hunger could be both biological and psychological. Now both these needs coincide and they push us towards purchasing food or grabbing food, and that creates the tension. That hunger creates the tension for us to show the drive, and that helps in satisfying our need. This even Lewin said. Then Zeigarnik tested the tension system hypothesis, stating that uh, tension creates the task to creates a task for resolving the problem. कि जब हमें hunger होती है, हमें tension होता है, we start looking for how we can procure food, by preparing food, by stealing it, by purchasing it or borrowing it, anything, but how to overall resolve the problem. So there have been contributions of Gestalt psychologists to study sensation, perception, and other diversified fields like learning, memory, problem solving, decision making. And Gestalt psychologists had, emphasized on holistic thought without compromising on objectivity in collecting the evidence. Holistic thought means the thought was not just in one direction. Now, if Sultan had to pluck a bunch of banana, his thought was not just, one way of using a stick. It's by chance that he saw. But he examined the whole scenario to, to finally look for a solution. Any solution would have been accepted. It was the creativity, the sudden problem solving that finally worked. So, Gestalt psychologists consider holistic thought and not a rigid or streamlined thought to solve a problem or learn a behavior. So, there have been criticisms as well, and it's about the topic of Gestalt psychology is primarily known for the topic of perception, and Wound and Tishner's structuralism was also criticized. And now in core Indian psychology, as I had discussed in the class, you need to rote learn the brief history of the development of how psychology had bloomed, how it had developed in India, with understanding, where the first psychology lab was formed. That was in Calcutta University, and Professor B.N. Seal and K. George, they had, made the syllabus for experimental psychology, which was in Calcutta University, and Indian Psychoanalytic Society was started in 1922. Basically, in this context of Indian perspective, you need to have the tips. What you need to have on your tips is the year and the event. That is majorly that is forming the Indian context of understanding psychology. So all these are given in points. Now you really need to mug up these points to frame your answer. इसमें कुछ भी conceptual नहीं है. There is nothing conceptual in Indian psychology. These are all the facts that need to be learned. Okay, so next topic comes is behaviorism. Uh, this theory deals with the assessment of human conduct and patterns available for observation. And this theory was earlier called as the black box theory, because given any input and output description, it is possible to fully know the model, and still it's not important to know what happens between the input and the output process. क्या होता है बिहेवियरिज्म में, हम ये नहीं देख रहे हैं कि इनपुट और आउटपुट के बीच में प्रोसेसिंग क्या हुआ, कैसे हमने किया, कैसे हमने समझा. हम बिहेवियरिज्म में ये देख रहे हैं कि क्या इनपुट था और किस तरह से हमने उसका आउटपुट दिखाया. So as per the school of behaviorism psychology, focus was on observable behavior of humans and animals instead of covert behavior which is going on within them. The school of psychology considers that behavior can be explained without depending on the internal physiological events, such as beliefs, and make it a more productive field of study. क्या होता है कई बार बिहेवियर का हम वी आर नॉट लुकिंग इनटू व्हाट इज इंटरनली कॉजिंग बिहेवियर विद इन अस. वी आर जस्ट सीइंग दैट हाउ that what is leading to that behavior, what input is leading to that behavior which is coming as a consequence as an output. So according to the assumption made by behaviorists, it is the environment and genetics which can influence our behavior. Behaviorists emphasize more on activity investigating the environmental variables that control our behavior, and emphasize less on possible internal mechanisms that mediate the environmental variables. Now, what behaviorists are focusing on is that ऐसा क्या है environment में जो हमारे बिहेवियर को मैनिपुलेट या कंट्रोल या मॉडिफाई कर पा रहा है. एंड लेस एम्फेसिस वाज गिवन ऑन व्हाट वाज गोइंग विद इन अस. बिहेवियरिस्ट ये एक तो बिहेवियरिस्ट ने हमेशा उन बिहेवियर्स पे फोकस किया है जो ऑब्जर्वेबल है और जो मेजरेबल है. अब हमारे अंदर क्या हो रहा है जिससे हम बिहेवियर दिखा पा रहे हैं, वो ना ऑब्जर्वेबल है क्योंकि अंदर हो रहा है, माइंड के अंदर हो रहा है, ब्रेन के अंदर हो रहा है, तो ये दिख नहीं रहा कि क्यों कि अंदर अंदर क्या हो रहा है. वो ऑब्जर्वेबल नहीं है, वो मेजरेबल नहीं है. हाँ, उसका कॉन्सिक्वेंस है जो एक लर्न बिहेवियर बन के आता है, वो है ऑब्जर्वेबल और मेजरेबल. So behaviorists emphasize more on activity investigating environmental variable than control our behavior, and emphasize less on possible internal mechanisms that mediate the environmental variables. Behaviorism often believes in the idea that all our behaviors are learned by conditioning. बिहेवियरिज्म के अकॉर्डिंग हम जो भी बिहेवियर सीखते हैं वो एक कंडीशनिंग की वजह से होता है। कंडीशनिंग में हम पेयर अप करते हैं स्टिमुलस को रिस्पॉन्स के साथ, और जब हम स्टिमुलस को रिस्पॉन्स के साथ लिंक करते हैं हमारा एक कॉन्सिक्वेंस जो बिहेवियर है वो बन के आता है। The idea of behaviorism can simply be stated as understanding the science of behavior which is possible. Methodological and radical behaviorists agree that the goal of psychology is to predict our responses that we will show at any given time as a function of stimuli. अब साइकोलॉजिस्ट का ये काम है कि जो भी हम बिहेवियर दिखा रहे हैं क्या वो प्रेडिक्टेबल है, क्या वो एज्यूम करके चल सकते हैं हम। सपोज इफ you are given, someone is praising you, and out of receiving that praise, that appreciation, you are showing an even better performance. Is it predictable that if you are praised your performance will go worse? No. Since you know you are appreciated for showing a behavior, you will try to sustain that behavior. So usually it is understood by behaviorists that any behavior is predictable. We can predict beforehand कि अगर ऐसा स्टिमुलस हम देंगे तो कैसा बिहेवियर निकल के आएगा। So methodological and radical behaviorists agree, however, that the goal of psychology is to predict our responses that we will show at any given time as function of stimuli present at that time and past conditioning. Our behavior is often learned by a process called conditioning, and it is a process of learning which can lead to habit formation. मतलब जब हम बार बार अपने आप को एक स्टिमुलस के साथ पेयर अप करते हैं तो हमारा क्या रिस्पॉन्स निकल के आता है वो हमारी आदत हो जाती है। Suppose if you know that at 10:30 in the school a bell rings, you will be accustomed to it कि जब 10:30 की बेल बजेगी वो लंच ब्रेक होगा, and that will continue till long. So once you are accustomed, once you are in a habit कि जब भी 10:30 की बेल बजी एकदम क्लास से भागो, टीचर चाहे क्लास के अंदर हो या ना हो, हम तो क्लास से जाएंगे, we will go to washroom, we will go to drink water, we will start eating food. So that when a behavior gets too much learned, that is because of the conditioning, it becomes a habit. So there are two types of conditionings. One is classical conditioning and the other is operant conditioning. Classical conditioning को हम stimulus learning भी कहते हैं, और operant conditioning को हम stimulus response conditioning भी कहते हैं. Why stimulus for classical conditioning? क्योंकि हम एक स्टिमुलस को दूसरे स्टिमुलस के साथ पेयर अप करते हैं, लिंक करते हैं, जोड़ते हैं। एक बेल को डॉग ने फूड के साथ लिंक किया कि जब भी बेल बजेगी एक दूसरा स्टिमुलस जो उसका फूड है वो मुझे मिलेगा, इसीलिए वो बेल को भी सुन सुन के सैलिवेट करने लगता है। सो दिस मॉडल ऑफ लर्निंग वी पुट particular action as a stimulus along with a fixed neutral response of the behavior. When an action or a stimulus becomes repeated, the automatic behavioral response at the end of it all is learned to be associated with the action. Then comes your operant conditioning. Operant conditioning को हम कहते हैं stimulus response learning, जिसमें हम reinforcements के वजह से एक response को सीख जाते हैं. It is a type of learning where a person learns something through educating without repression or through gradual progressive steps. This is also called as instrumental conditioning. इसके दो और नाम है, operant conditioning के दो और नाम है, एक तो है SR conditioning, stimulus response conditioning, दूसरा है instrumental conditioning. So the behavioral school of psychology is applied to many ideas and techniques which we widely use even today. अब इसके जो है बहुत सारे टेक्निक्स हैं जो हम आज भी अप्लाई करते हैं. आपने देखा होगा कभी स्कूल में क्लास में आपको ये कहती होगी टीचर कि बच्चे आपको 5 रेड स्टार्स नोटबुक में मिलेंगे, तो एक रेड स्टार आपको क्लास के चार्ट पे मिलेगा सबके सामने. So that was what? Exchange of one red star, which was equivalent to 5 small stars in the notebook. That was a token economy. कि बहुत सारी अच्छी अच्छी छोटी छोटी चीजें कर लो, उसके एक्सचेंज में एक बहुत बड़ी चीज आपको रिवॉर्ड में मिलती है. देन एवर्जन थेरेपी, जो हम काफी अप्लाई करते हैं डी एडिक्शन के लिए, कि कैसे एक चीज से हम एवर्स कर जाते हैं जिससे हम पहले एवर्स नहीं कर रहे थे. जैसे जो बेबी जॉन है, जॉन वॉटसन का जो बेबी था, ही स्टार्टेड एवर्सिंग द स्टफ टॉय बिकॉज ईच टाइम ही सॉ द स्टफ टॉय देयर वाज अ लाउड साउंड प्लेड and he started reversing it, he started running away from it. So it could also change the frequency of the behavior or modify a behavior. So if we see the concept of behaviorism, it was started by Ivan Pavlov, a Russian psychologist, and it was found what is known as, he found what is now called as classical conditioning. And behaviorism was formally established in 1913 when the American psychologist John Watson suggested that if he was given his own specified environment for a baby to grow up, then he could ensure that the baby would turn into a sort of person needed to be perfect in any trade. So behaviorism says that a human or even an animal can be tamed in whichever direction you want to tame them, because they get so accustomed, they get so conditioned, just the way they you want them to be conditioned, just the way you want them to become. So for the level of behaviorism as a measurable field, the researchers can analyze the behavior scientifically. क्या होता है behaviorism? We know that behaviorists say behavior should always be observable and measurable. Anything which can be measured, it can be understood even scientifically. And as per the school of behaviorism, behaviors are often understood on a scientific note. We can also observe that behaviorism had an impact on our language development. Why? Because we end up learning language many a times by observing others, by imitating others, and those others whom we observe, whom we copy, are the models. If we are learning a language from our parents, then our parents are our models and we end up imitating our parents. So behavioral psychology is one of the branches of psychology that centers its attention in the observation and analysis of how any given controlled setting can alter a behavior. कि कोई भी behavior किस वजह से बदला जा सकता है. And the aim of these methods to understand the behavior is for controlling and modifying a person's behavior that is both controllable and observable. Behaviorism में हम सिर्फ वो ही behavior बदल सकते हैं जो हम observe कर सकते हैं, जो हम measure कर सकते हैं. जो हमें दिखाई नहीं दे रहा, जिसको हम ऑब्जर्व नहीं कर पा रहे, उस बिहेवियर को हम ना स्टडी कर सकते, ना मॉडिफाई कर सकते. So a learning theory suggests that we tend to act towards shaping a new behavior by experimenting and learning until something pleasant in the form of behavior is expected. So behaviorists do not look at what is happening within us, since that cannot necessarily be physically observed. कोई भी behaviorist हमारे अंदर झांक के नहीं हमारे behavior को समझ सकता. वो हमारे behavior को एक experiment से या एक किसी भी scientific तरह से ही समझ पाएगा जो दिख सकता है. An idea of behaviorism addresses how behavior alteration can be achieved by observing a controlled environment. Behaviorism hinges on two major principles. First is the belief that environment is responsible for all the human actions and not in the mind. मतलब जो human actions है वो सिर्फ हमारा जो state of mind है उससे कंट्रोल नहीं होते, बल्कि एनवायरनमेंट का भी बहुत ज्यादा असर पड़ता है हमारे बिहेवियर पे. Secondly, behavior modifier considers that all the behavior can be understood and explained by a way in which humans respond to environments. So, any behavior that is learned can be modified, can also be unlearned. So, there have been various branches of behaviorism. First is radical behaviorism, which claims that science of behavior can be a natural science. And this is what makes radical behaviorism radical. मतलब जो behaviorism एक natural science है, हमारा behavior एक natural phenomenon है, हमारा हिस्सा है, उस नजरिए से समझने को हम radical behaviorism कहते हैं. Then comes methodological behaviorism. It is a normative theory of how psychological science is supposed to be conducted. This is because it claims that psychology should address behavior of organisms, whether humans or non-humans, rather than the mental state of events. इसका मतलब ये है आसान तरह से कि हमारे अंदर क्या क्या मेंटल स्टेट है हमारा, whether we are angry, frustrated, excited, happy, whatsoever is our mental state, that is not the importance. Importance is the impact of the mental state on how we are behaving. And that impact of mental state on our behavior, it is directly connected to the internal information. हमारा behavior हमारे बहुत तरह के internal information स्टडी करने का एक जरिया हो सकता है. Then comes teleological behaviorism, and this behaviorism says that our mental life resides in overt behavior. इसका मतलब ये है कि जो भी हमारे अंदर जो भी मेंटल स्टेट है, हमारा जो कॉग्निटिव प्रोसेसेस चलते हैं हमारे अंदर, वो एक वो हमारे ओवर्ट बिहेवियर में भी दिखता है. ओवर्ट मतलब ऑब्जर्वेबल, जो दिखे. कोवर्ट मतलब कवर्ड, जो नहीं दिखता. सो समथिंग विच मेक्स teleological behaviorism unique is its emphasis on self control and free will. Then comes your classical behaviorism. These are all the types of behaviorisms, and classical behaviorism is committed to demonstrating the fact which was once supposed to need an introspective attention. It was further characterized by strict determinism, believing every response can be elicited by a specific stimulus. मतलब क्लासिकल behaviorism ये कहता है कि हर response एक stimulus की वजह से ही निकल के आ रहा है. अगर कोई stimulus नहीं होगा तो कोई उसका corresponding response भी नहीं आएगा. और neo behaviorism had immediately stemmed from the classical behaviorism. So there have been contributors of behaviorism. First was John Watson. He had also studied on that baby named Albert, and his study was on a few months old, a 9 months old infant, and it showed the fear of white rats or other animals. Why? Because the moment white rats were shown, it was, associated with a very, very loud and scary noise. And that scary noise was paired with the white rats, making Albert very, very scared of rats, which led to an irrational fear. So Albert played with a white rat and seemed completely at ease. He was comfortable with white rats. But then Watson paired the rat with a loud, frightening noise and a hammer striking a metal bar. This loud sound scared Albert. And now, when it repeatedly happened, then Albert developed a fear. He developed a phobia of white rats. And this was very much a conditioned stimulus with a conditioned response. So, finally, what he concluded by this study on little Albert was that emotions could be conditioned and the fear could be learned by pairing up, which is called as association. So emotions are not all the emotions which are existing within us, they are a consequence of how we are conditioned. White rat से अल्बर्ट हमेशा नहीं डरता था, उसकी कंडीशनिंग जब इस तरह से हुई कि उसको एक डराया गया, वो डरना शुरू हुआ. So all the emotions can very much be conditioned. So Watson was, the person who launched about the behaviorism. He had started the concept of behaviorism, and he suggested human subjects and carrying out the tests similar to animal experiments. So he did not just, study animals. He had even, replicated his studies on humans, which he had done on animals. He wanted to study whether the same can be applied on humans as well or not. And sharp and clear consciousness and introspective thoughts and feeling that cannot be seen or altered by scientific equipment, as well as that which can be possibly dismissed. Okay, this line is a bit confusing, but let me tell you the crux, that thoughts and feelings can also be understood with a lot of scientific method, scientific equipment, and they are not just a haphazard way of existence. So John Watson, in his famous is famous for using his techniques of classical conditioning on people, and we have already discussed about little Albert. Then Ivan Pavlov, he was very, very famous for his classical conditioning experiment, which he did on a dog, and he introduced the concepts of conditioned stimulus and conditioned response, unconditioned stimulus and unconditioned response. Now, something that is important about this is that you must know which all are the conditioned and unconditioned stimulus, which all are the conditioned and unconditioned response. First, bell. Bell is a conditioned stimulus, which initially is neutral stimulus. First, the dog never salivated on the bell whenever the bell rang. It is later through conditioning that he started salivating. So unconditioned stimulus is something which leads to an unconditioned response. खाने के लिए डॉग को कंडीशनिंग की जरूरत नहीं है. Moment he sees food, he will automatically start salivating. He doesn't need any training or taming to start salivating by seeing his favorite food. But yes, he doesn't have any significance of bell in his life. He is not born to salivate for a bell. No one will actually react to a bell until there is a link. If bell is linked to food, so first the bell will ring, then the food will come, and then the dog will end up eating the food. Then he will start understanding with some trials that yes, bell means food is going to come. So bell is is a conditioned stimulus. Food is an unconditioned stimulus. But salivation, which was earlier only towards food, was an unconditioned stimulus, which later became a conditioned stimulus after the bell started being associated with food. So these are some of the important terms which are very, very important from Viva point of view. न्यूट्रल स्टिमुलस. न्यूट्रल स्टिमुलस वो है जिसके तरफ कोई रिस्पॉन्स नहीं दिखाया जा रहा है. बेल इज अ न्यूट्रल स्टिमुलस. डॉग डजंट सैलिवेट बाय जस्ट सीइंग द बेल. सो न्यूट्रल स्टिमुलस में प्रायर टू कंडीशनिंग देयर इज नो रिस्पॉन्स. अनकंडीशनड स्टिमुलस, वो स्टिमुलस जिसको जिसके तरफ रिस्पॉन्स दिखाने के लिए कोई ट्रेनिंग नहीं चाहिए. So it is a stimulus that automatically generates a response without any deliberate learning required. The dog is not taught by anyone to start salivating seeing his favorite food. That happens as a reflex. Then comes a conditioned stimulus. Once, which was a neutral stimulus, after being repeatedly associated with an unconditioned stimulus, activates the conditioned response. Conditioned stimulus जो है वो है बेल. जो पहले एक न्यूट्रल स्टिमुलस था, उस न्यूट्रल स्टिमुलस को जब फूड के साथ साथ दिखाया गया कि पहले घंटी बजी, फिर फूड आया, फिर डॉग ने फूड को देख के सैलिब्रेट किया, फिर उसने खाना खाया, तो बेल जो एक अनकंडीशनड स्टिमुलस था, वो फूड के साथ दिख दिख के डॉग के लिए वो एक कंडीशन स्टिमुलस हो गया है. बेल बजेगी, खाना आएगा, फिर बेल बजेगी अगले दिन, फिर खाना आएगा, जब भी खाना आएगा उससे पहले बेल बजेगी. That will make bell linked with food, making it a conditioned stimulus for a dog. Eventually what will happen, even if food will not come but the bell will ring, the dog will immediately pair up कि हाँ बेल बज गई ना, अब खाना आने वाला है, तो फूड आएगा भी नहीं कि डॉग का सैलिवेशन शुरू हो जाएगा बेल के बजते ही. That will be the conditioned response towards the conditioned stimulus, that is the bell. So conditioned response is that response which is condition, which is corresponding to the conditioned stimulus. जो response एक conditioned stimulus की तरफ है, वो एक conditioned response ही है. डॉग का सैलिवेशन बेल के लिए एक conditioned response बन चुका था because of several trials. Then comes unconditioned response. अगर बेल ही भी बजेगी और खाना दिख जाएगा ना, तब भी डॉग खाने को देख के पहले सैलिवेट ही करेगा. Then comes stimulus generalization. क्या डॉग हर बेल के बजने पे सैलिवेट करता है? Whether it's a doorbell or the bell for the dog or an alarm, क्या हर बेल पे डॉग सैलिवेट कर रहा है? Means is he associating every bell with food? That is a stimulus generalization. सारे एक समान है, सारे स्टिमुलाई एक समान है. That is stimulus generalization. लेकिन अगर डॉग सिर्फ एक बेल की आवाज को सुन के ही सैलिवेट करता है और ना कि हर बेल की आवाज को सुन के, वो उसका स्टिमुलस डिस्क्रिमिनेशन हो गया. बिकॉज ही इज एबल टू डिफरेंशिएट बिटवीन विच बेल इज फॉर द फूड एंड विच ऑल अदर बेल्स आर नॉट फॉर द फूड. विंड चाइम की आवाज से वो सैलिवेट नहीं करेगा, डोर बेल की आवाज से वो सैलिवेट नहीं करेगा, वो एक स्पेसिफिक बेल से ही सैलिवेट करेगा, क्योंकि वो उस बेल को पहचान चुका है फूड के साथ पेयर अप करके. यस गायत्री, प्लीज आस्क.
मैम, हाउ विल दे डिस्क्रिमिनेट?
बाय द साउंड, विद द रिपीटेड ट्रायल. बार बार एक ही तरह की
मैम,
घंटी
what
उसको
if
सुनाई
all
देगी
the
खाना देने से पहले.
मैम, what if all the sounds will be the same?
कैन यू प्लीज रिपीट?
मैम, what if all the sounds will be the same?
हाँ, देन व्हाट डू यू वांट
मैम,
टू
then
आस्क
how
इन
will
दैट?
they discriminate? मैम, मैं पूछना
सी,
चाहती हूँ कि अगर सारे साउंड सेम होंगे तो फिर वो कैसे डिस्क्रिमिनेट करेंगे?
वो तो जनरलाइजेशन हो गया ना कि सारे साउंड्स एक जैसे ही इसमें लिखा है. This principle implies that after the learner has been conditioned to respond to a certain way to any stimulus. मतलब अगर हर घंटी पे वो सैलिवेट ही कर रहा है तो हर घंटी को वो बराबर समझ रहा है. That is a generalization. लेकिन अगर कोई अलग सी घंटी सुनाई देती है उसको, when he is able to differentiate by the pitch of the sound, कि doorbell is very very, it has a deep sound, or the bell which is for the food, it has a very a very shrill sound, or it has a very loud sound, or the doorbell has a very soft sound. तो अगर बार बार उसको यही कहा जाता है कि इस घंटी का मतलब खाना है, ना कि किसी और घंटी का मतलब खाना है, और जब वो ये खुद ऑब्जर्व करेगा कि यार घंटी तो बजी लेकिन खाना ही नहीं आया, ये जब भी ये वाली घंटी बजती तभी खाना आता है. जब उसको स्टिमुलस नहीं मिलेगा खाने का घंटी के बजने पे, वो समझ जाएगा कि ये घंटी मेरे काम की नहीं है. दैट विल लीड टू स्टिमुलस डिस्क्रिमिनेशन. डोर बेल के बजने पे जब उसको खाना नहीं मिल रहा, वो समझ जाए कि डोर बेल इज नॉट सिग्निफिकेंट फॉर मी, इट इज द अदर बेल विच द मास्टर रिंग्स बिफोर गिविंग मी द फूड दैट इज गोइंग टू बी सिग्निफिकेंट। मेरे काम की वो बेल है, डोर बेल या कोई और अलार्म की बेल नहीं।
Okay, ma'am, got it.
देन कम्स एक्सटिंक्शन। एक्सटिंक्शन क्या होता है कि बहुत दिनों तक आपने ऐसा कोई स्टिमुलस नहीं दिखाया जिसके तरफ डॉग कंडीशन था, तो उसका बिहेवियर भी आना बंद हो गया। आप उसको सिर्फ खाना देने लग गए बिना बेल बजाए, और अचानक से आपने फिर से घंटी बजाई, मे बी आफ्टर अ वीक 10 days, द डॉग इज एबल टू रिकॉल कि यार ये तो दोबारा से घंटी बज रही है। जब एक्सटिंक्शन था उसका सैलिवेशन भी बंद हो गया कि ठीक है, बेल तो बज नहीं रही तो मैं क्यों सैलिवेट करूं, नो पॉइंट ऑफ सैलिवेटिंग इफ द बेल इज नॉट रिंगिंग। बट suddenly you after 7 to 10 days again start ringing the bell, and it was amazing to see that once the bell again started to ring, again the conditioned response, which is a salivation, it started. So spontaneous recovery, recovery मतलब दोबारा वो दिखाना response, and spontaneous means sudden, फटाफट response दिखाता है, दोबारा ट्रेनिंग नहीं चाहिए उसको। So spontaneous recovery is a reappearance of a learned response after extinction. Remember one thing, that spontaneous recovery will always come after the stage of extinction, not before that. So the inhibition weakens, particularly if the original conditioned stimulus has been absent for some time. When the original conditioned stimulus returns during spontaneous recovery, our conditioned response may briefly reappear, but it is usually weak and short-lived. Then comes your acquisition. Acquisition happens when the response is being established after a period of dissociative learning. It is that stage of classical conditioning when the stimulus comes to evoke a conditioned response. Acquisition मतलब जब नया नया स्टेज होता है लर्निंग करने का, acquire से acquisition बना है, that is the initial stage of learning. आप ग्राफ में भी यहाँ पे देख रहे हैं कि पहला स्टेज है acquisition, मतलब अभी वो ट्रेनिंग हो ही रही है, the dog is still getting tamed to associate food with bell. Then eventually the graph reaches a peak, but if the bell stops ringing, his salivation will also stop. That is why the graph is coming down. And after a couple of days, after some time, after some lapse, again you can see the uh, salivation has started after listening to the bell. That is why you can see that after a week's time, this graph doesn't begin with 0 like it was beginning in acquisition. It starts from the middle, क्योंकि वो पूरी तरह से बिहेवियर को भूला नहीं है, उसको कुछ कुछ वो बिहेवियर याद है। इसीलिए ये जब दोबारा से स्पॉन्टेनियस रिकवरी का स्टेज होता है, ये 0 से स्टार्ट नहीं होता, जिसके वजह से ये जहां पे वीक वर्ड लिखा है वो वहां से नहीं शुरू हो रहा, वो बीच में से शुरू हो रहा है। So there are two types of conditioning, forward and backward conditionings. And in forward there are further 3 types of conditionings. जिसमें पहला है simultaneous, मतलब फूड और बेल को इकट्ठा आपने पेश किया डॉग के आगे, बेल के बजते बेल के बजने के साथ साथ फूड दे रहे हैं आप, बेल बज रही है फूड आ रहा है, बेल बज रही है फूड आ रहा है, दैट इज simultaneous, दोनों साथ में आए। नेक्स्ट इज ट्रेस कंडीशनिंग, बेल बजी 1-2 सेकंड के बाद फूड आ गया, विच इज द मोस्ट एफिशिएंट वे ऑफ टीचिंग। एंड देन कम्स डिलेड कंडीशनिंग, बेल बजी उसके 10 मिनट बाद खाना आया, by the time the food came the effect of bell got nullified, so it is a most redundant way of conditioning a dog. Best is trace, कि बेल बजी, थोड़ा वक्त हुआ, एकदम खाना आया. सो सैमल्टेनियस के साथ आप शुरू कर सकते हैं कंडीशनिंग को, एंड देन इट कैन लीड टू ट्रेस कंडीशनिंग. बट डिलेड कंडीशनिंग विल नॉट बी of much importance because the significance of the bell will diminish. And backward conditioning is of no use, though it is a concept कि first you are giving the food and then you are ringing the bell. मतलब पहले बेल का फूड था, वो था फॉरवर्ड. फॉरवर्ड के थे 3 कैटेगरीज, सैमल्टेनियस, ट्रेस एंड डिलेड. अब हो गया उल्टा कि पहले फूड दिया फिर बेल बजाई. जब फूड डॉग को मिल ही चुका है तो बेल का कोई फायदा नहीं है उसके लिए, बचती रहे बेल. बेल विल बी ऑफ नो यूज if the food is given before the bell is ringing. उसको खाने से मतलब है खाना मिल गया. So that is why backward conditioning will have a very very poor association of learning. All this was about Pavlov. Then comes about Skinner. Skinner ने बात करी थी operant conditioning के बारे में, where there is stimulus response learning. So there was once upon a time a hungry rat in the box. अब भाई rat is hungry, he is struggling, he is looking for the food. Luckily, he was exploring the box, the Skinner's box. And when he was exploring the box all over to search for the food, he saw that there is a button type structure called lever. Liver nahi, lever. Lever is something that when you press, it can give a beep beep sound or a light. And after the lever got pressed, the rat saw, wow, my favorite piece has come up. So then the rat started learning. So one trial was not enough. One trial mein he was just exploring. Eventually he saw, oh, again by chance lever got pressed by my paws. मेरे पैरों से फिर से लेवर प्रेस हो गया और फिर से खाना आ गया. वाह. Again it's getting pressed, again food came. This way, with multiple trials, the rat started learning that each time I press the lever, the food pellets come out and I'm able to satiate my hunger. So, the main key takeaway of this experiment was that there are positive outcomes. Positive outcomes increase a behavior. जितनी बार रैट ने लेवर दबाया उतनी बार खाना मिल गया. अब खाना तो रैट के लिए पॉजिटिव आउटकम ही है कि रैट ने जब भी लेवर दबाया, लेवर दबाने की मेहनत तो हुई लेकिन कम से कम उसको खाना मिल गया फिर. सो the negative outcomes also decrease as the positive outcomes increase. Why wouldn't he press the lever if he's getting food out of pressing it? He will definitely press it. So his work laid the groundwork for operant conditioning, influencing fields like education and behavior therapy. So we can understand reinforcement as any stimulus that strengthens or increases the likelihood of a response by associating it with consequences, transforming that action into a conditioned reinforcer. So, see, food is a natural source of giving a reinforcement. Food के लिए ज़्यादा मेहनत नहीं करनी है because food will help the rat to survive. But if anything else needs to be made a reinforcement, then certain conditioning is needed. So reinforcement is considered as a stimulus which increases the frequency with which a response occurs. मतलब reinforcement एक response को एक favorable behavior को बढ़ाने का एक जरिया है. If we want that a favorable behavior should be shown more frequently, we must give a reinforcement until the favorable behavior is completely learned and synchronized with. So the frequency of favorable or desired behavior is likely to increase in the future if praise is used to reinforce it. Suppose if you get full marks and your parents praise you, they give you an ice cream or a chocolate, you will learn that showing that behavior is worth. आपके full marks लाना went worth, because getting full marks, gave you appreciation, gave you a recognition, gave you the favorite prize that you wanted. So reinforcement can include anything which strengthens, sustains, or even increases the behavior. According to Skinner's operant conditioning, there are 4 types of reinforcements. First is the positive reinforcement. Positive reinforcement includes the rewards, prizes, and that helps to increase the frequency of a favorable behavior. This method is based on the belief that positive consequences can increase the probability for us to repeat the favorable behavior. कि अगर हमें बार बार फेवरेबल कॉन्सिक्वेंसेस मिलते गए, बार बार हमें तारीफ मिल रही है, बार बार हमें प्राइज मिल रहा है, तो हमें भी ऐसा बिहेवियर दिखाने में कोई नुकसान नहीं है. We will show it in even better way. Then comes negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is to inhibit or to avoid a behavior. अगर आपको ठंड लग रही है और ठंड लगने पे आपने स्वेटर पहना, क्यों पहना? Because you wanted to avoid shivering. You wanted to avoid feeling the discomfort of feeling cold. So wearing a sweater in that case becomes a negative reinforcement. Then comes positive punishment. It involves applying negative consequences for discouraging and undesirable behavior. It is in accordance with the principle which states that by associating an unpleasant outcome with a specific behavior, a person is less likely to repeat that behavior in future. So positive punishment is for reducing an unfavorable behavior by associating it with an unpleasant outcome. So it can create an aversive experience. मतलब आपका बहुत ही अनप्लेजेंट और बिटर एक्सपीरियंस रह सकता है because of the punishment, and you can understand the consequences of your action and develop some level of self control. Now to avoid certain punishments, you would feel that it is better not to show a behavior than to tolerate a painful punishment as a consequence. हाँ जी. Okay, so next is the negative punishment. So it is a concept within the framework of behaviorism by which we intend to reduce the frequency of an unfavorable behavior by removing the desired stimulus. Matlab, that is actually what we associate punishment with since our childhood. कि अच्छा, so we didn't obey our parents, so parents they didn't give us food, or they slapped us, or they locked us in a room, or they didn't talk to us, or they didn't let us watch the TV. So any negative punishment is associated with a very very bitter consequence, or a very unfavorable consequence for showing an unfavorable behavior. So we apply negative punishment to understand how environment in which we can influence our behavior. Our negative punishment is one of the ways which is applied to shape and modify our behavior. So actually, negative punishment is with the intention of changing an unfavorable behavior to a favorable behavior. एक अनवांटेड बिहेवियर को हमें हटाना है और एक वांटेड बिहेवियर को हमें सस्टेन रखना है। लेकिन एक नेगेटिव पनिशमेंट के और भी बहुत अनफेवरेबल कॉन्सिक्वेंसेस हो सकते हैं। फॉर एग्जाम्पल, वेंजेंस, the child might learn to take revenge, the child might become more aggressive, the child might not improve upon the behavior. So the purpose of negative punishment is to help us engage in certain behaviors which can further lead to the loss of something which we value. Then comes the concept of primary reinforcers, which naturally motivate our behavior. For example, if we are hungry and we are eating chocolate, that is our primary reinforcer. Or secondary reinforcer would be getting an award. An award won't immediately gratify our immediate needs, but it will help us maintain our favorable behavior. Maybe a certificate or a trophy. We can't fulfill our physiological needs with that, but our self-actualization or higher needs can definitely be sustained and fulfilled. Then there are schedules of reinforcement. First is continuous, कि जब भी एक favorable response आया, एकदम से हमने एक reinforcement दे दिया. Whenever a response happens, immediately a reinforcement is given. That is your continuous reinforcement. And generally it can be applied when a behavior needs to be taught. A new behavior needs to be taught. But as the new behavior is well adapted to, a person is well synchronized with the new behavior, he has learnt it completely, then eventually partial reinforcement schedule can be given. So continuous reinforcement में जैसे एक अच्छा बिहेवियर दिखाया बच्चे ने, ओबीडियंस दिखाई, एकदम से मम्मी ने एक टॉफी दे दिया, दैट इज योर कंटिन्यूअस. पार्शियल है कि कभी रीइंफोर्समेंट मिला, कभी नहीं मिला. सो अब क्या होता है, पार्शियल रीइंफोर्समेंट का एक फायदा होता है, जैसे गैम्बल है. इन गैम्बल समटाइम्स पीपल विन लॉट ऑफ मनी एंड समटाइम्स दे डोंट, सो दैट इज पार्शियल. एंड so partial reinforcement schedules depend on one of the two things. The time it takes for the next availability of a reinforcer. कि अब पता नहीं भैया reinforcer दोबारा कब मिलेगा, no guarantee. जैसे continuous में तो मिलता ही रहता है, it's taken for granted. Partial में कभी मिल सकता है, कभी नहीं मिल सकता, पता नहीं कब मिल जाए, इसलिए behavior दिखाते रहो, पता नहीं कब तुक्का लग जाए. So next comes your fixed ratio, like salary, हर महीने मिलना. विद फिक्स्ड जैसे सैलरी होती है, हर महीने वही अमाउंट मिलता है, अमाउंट है रेशियो के लिए. सो सैलरी वी नो एवरी मंथ वी विल गेट ओनली दिस मच ऑफ मनी, दैट इज योर फिक्स्ड रेशियो. So it requires a consistent number of responses, like go to office every day of the month, and at the end of the month you get certain amount of money as a salary, that is your fixed ratio. Then comes variable ratio, kabhi zyada kabhi kam. Sometimes it happens in shares. Sometimes the shares go very high, the amount touches the sky of the shares, the value of the shares, and sometimes it turns into a loss, that is a variable ratio. Then comes fixed interval, like salary, mahine mein ek baar, every end of the month you will receive, that is your fixed interval. So a fixed interval maintains a constant time gap in between. If we know that every last date of the month we will receive a salary, that is a constant time. हर महीने के हमें 30-31 का वेट करना ही पड़ेगा. That time will not change. It won't increase, it won't decrease. It's constant. Then comes variable interval. Means there is no constant time gap. कभी भी हो सकता है. So the average interval is a variable interval schedule is predetermined. So in variable interval schedule reinforces the initial response which takes place after a variable time interval. So rewards may not be distributed, at a fixed time. They can be distributed a lot initially or a lot at the end, and in between, maybe they are not getting any rewards. So the interval may keep changing. The time period between getting the rewards, it may keep changing. Then comes the social learning theory, and in which Albert Bandura had, done an experiment of Bobo doll, in which, the concept of observational learning and imitation were understood. So in his experiment, Albert Bandura had shown a video. He had made two groups, group A and group B. To both the groups, he had shown different videos. In group A, he had shown a video in which the Bobo doll, a type of toy, it was taken care of. People were cuddling it. People were very, very softly playing with it. People were showing a loving, adorable behavior towards the doll as a toy, as their favorite toy. In the other video, whereas, which was shown to group B, the in the video, the children were cooking the Bobo doll. They were throwing it. They were trying to puncture it. They were boxing it. So there were two extremes of the behavior that were shown. One is extremely, extremely loving, adorable, and pro-social. The other is extremely violent, aggressive, and antisocial behavior. Now, after a while, the video was stopped, and children were also asked that, they can play with the Bobo doll the way they want. And what happened? The children of the two groups imitated or copied the behavior of the respective videos that they were shown. So finally, Bandura concluded that children learn behaviors through observation and imitation. Children are born as a blank slate. It is by observing others and by copying others, they end up learning certain behavior. And this experiment had highlighted the impact of role models and media on behavior, emphasizing that we learn not just from direct experience, but also by watching others. So, this was called the social learning theory given by Albert Bandura, because our behavior is influenced by our social environment. We learn a lot from what the society is giving us by our models. Our parents, peers, teachers, media, they all are our models whom we end up imitating or copying to learn certain behavior. Now, whether we are copying a favorable or an adaptive behavior, or an unfavorable or a maladaptive behavior, that varies. So it implies that people change their behaviors on the basis of behaviors that other people perform by copying them. So a model's behavior will be most influential when it's giving a reinforcing consequences. अगर हम किसी का behavior copy करते हैं और उससे हमें कोई फायदा मिलता है, चाहे कोई पर्सनल बेनिफिट है, चाहे सोशल एक्सेप्टेंस है, पर जब हमें कोई फायदा मिलेगा, we will be imitating that behavior more often. When the learners perceive the model in a positive way, जब हमें ये लगता है कि हमारे लिए ये मॉडल बहुत अच्छा है, this person is our favorite, we will follow the footsteps of this person, we have blind faith in this person, we will end up imitating that model's behavior, be it parents, teachers, peer, or any other public figure. So there are some similarities between models and observers. The model's behavior should be visible and clear to the observer. ऑब्जर्वर वो है जो देख के सीख रहा है, मॉडल वो है जिसका बिहेवियर सीखना है. आई होप दिस डिफरेंस इज क्लियर. इज इट क्लियर टू एवरीवन? अगर मैं किसी का बिहेवियर देख के सीख रही हूं, वो मेरे लिए एक मॉडल है और मैं उसके लिए एक ऑब्जर्वर हूं. So a model behavior is very, very important because it helps in learning that which behavior needs to be learned. अभी ऑब्जर्वर के ऊपर भी है कि किसका बिहेवियर वो ऑब्जर्व करता है. तो व्हाट इज अ मॉडल? मॉडल वो है जिसका आप बिहेवियर इमिटेट कर रहे हैं, बी इट पीयर, बी इट पेरेंट्स, बी इट टीचर्स, बी इट एनी सेलिब्रिटी. किसी का भी आप बिहेवियर कॉपी कर सकते हैं, और वो जो सोर्स है आपको बिहेवियर सिखाने का, वो आपका मॉडल है. So Woodward stated that behavior depends on environment stimulus plus genetic endowment. अब देखिए, एनवायरमेंट तो है ही, लेकिन जेनेटिकली इसलिए क्योंकि टेम्परामेंट भी वेरी कर सकता है. वे कोई अगर शॉर्ट टेम्पर्ड है तो चाहे कितना भी उसको अच्छा बिहेवियर दिखा दे, टेम्परामेंट विल बिकम अ हिंड्रेंस इन दैट केस. So what you are carrying genetically in your personality, that will also pay in learning what behavior you want to show. So he tried to make a sense of human action by synthesizing theories of motivation, perception, learning, thinking. So Woodward's purpose stemmed from causal paradigms in order to explain how or why individuals behave in the manner in which they do. कि वो समझना ये चाह रहा था कि जिस भी तरह से हम behave करते हैं, हम ऐसा क्यों behave करते हैं. So Woodward says that drive definitely stimulates our behavior. He had talked about the concept of drive. Drive here doesn't mean driving. Drive here means the motivation, that feeling which pushes us to show a behavior. So he also pointed out that behavior is done with the intention of having impact on one's surroundings, and also drive-based motives are better understood in the context of being able to have impact in one's surroundings. Then comes the work of Thorndike. Thorndike had also talked about the puzzle box and the cat and the hungry cat. So he, to see how quickly the cat could escape to get food waiting outside, in the first attempt, Thorndike placed the cat inside the box and observed. And he had also talked about the concept of cognitive mapping. ये जो आज हम AI यूज करते हैं, Google यूज करते हैं, that's fine, but it has been the imitation of this concept only of cognitive mapping. अगर मैं आप ये पूछती हूँ आपसे कि आपको कैसे पता कि आपको घर से कॉलेज तक कैसे आना है, क्या आपको रास्ता याद है या नहीं है? You might say हाँ हमें रास्ता याद है, but आपको रास्ते का कैसे याद हुआ, वो इमेजिन कैसे कर पाए, वो विजुअल इमेजेस कैसे बना पाए? दैट इज बिकॉज ऑफ द कॉग्निटिव मैपिंग. मैप एक तो है जो ज्योग्राफिकल मैप है, वो तो आपको नक्शे बताएगा, लेकिन आपको कैसे याद है कि मुझे कैसे कैसे आना है या जाना है, या रूट क्या है, किस तरह से मुझे घर के अंदर घुसना है, किस तरह से घर से बाहर निकलना है. ऑल दीज आर द कॉग्निटिव मैपिंग. And same happened with the cat. The cat ended up registering the puzzle box so well that she got to know that from where the food will come, at which location of the puzzle box will I get the food. So he also talked about law of effect, which states that behaviors followed by satisfying outcomes are likely to be repeated. And Thorndike's experiment demonstrated that learning is a gradual process that can be shaped by rewards. कि learning को हम rewards की वजह से sustain रख सकते हैं. So Thorndike's best known theory is the stimulus and response connection, which is better known as SR theory of behavior. And it was written in a bid to pass the understanding of animal behavior and how their learning can be pulled from human mode. And definitely all these learning behaviors were to acquire a pleasurable consequence. कि अगर हम behavior को learn कर रहे हैं, उसके बदले हमें फायदा क्या मिल रहा है? फायदा है आपका pleasurable consequence. जैसे अगर रैट ने पूरा नक्शा समझ लिया पजल बॉक्स का, अंत में क्या हुआ? उसको खाना मिला. या कैट को भी अंत में क्या हुआ, खाना मिला. So there are the laws of effect of Thorndike, and the responses which get a positive consequence as a follow up are more likely to occur in future. मतलब जिन responses को दिखाने का फायदा मिलता है वो ही आगे तक सस्टेन रहते हैं. जब उनको दिखाने का फायदा नहीं मिलेगा वो रेस्पॉन्स दिखना बंद हो जाएगा. Then comes law of readiness. Learning becomes more effective when we are motivated and ready to learn. And then comes law of exercise, and according to this law, learning occurs when we repeat and practice. वो हम कहते हैं ना, practice makes the man perfect. That is because of exercise. Every time we are showing the same behavior again and again, which is helping us become habitual of it. Then comes law of multiple responses. According to this law, there are other multiple responses to a given stimulus, and learning takes place when we strengthen the connections between appropriate responses and stimulus. Okay, so next comes the neo-behaviorism. So neo means new, and behaviorism is the school of psychology which continues, and it was developed by J.B. Watson, whose purpose was to focus on things which are practical, and he believed that every stimulus led to a behavior. Because we always say every action has a reaction, so every stimulus, जो भी हम environment में stimulus दे रहे हैं, उन stimulus का एक reaction जरूर दिखेगा. And just the way Watson was a father of behaviorism, the father of new behaviorism was Tolman. So first we understand about Tolman, and he had also done an experiment on the rats and about the maze, and rats had navigated the maze efficiently using their mental map, which is also the concept of cognitive mapping. And Tolman concluded that rats weren't just responding to the rewards, but they were also using cognitive maps. कि मतलब अगर हम किसी भी तरह से किसी एक दिशा से हम चलेंगे, एक डायरेक्शन पे एक रैट चलेगा, तो चलते चलते उसको कोई खाना मिल जाएगा. तो वो सिर्फ खाना खाने के लिए ही नहीं रैट्स लर्न कर रहे थे रूट को, बल्कि अपने बाकी भी प्रॉब्लम्स को सॉल्व करने के लिए रूट को लर्न कर रहे थे, मे बी टू इवन एस्केप फ्रॉम द मेज. So his purposive behaviorism too, as a sign learning theory, appears as a link between behaviorism and cognition. Tolman's behaviorism is called by even other names such as sign significance theory, expectancy theory, purposive behaviorism और simple sign theory. ये चारों options हैं. ये सारे MCQs में आ सकते हैं. I'm warning you that please read these chapters to have a good performance for MCQs. Then comes latent learning. Latent learning मतलब वो जो learn करते हुए दिखाई नहीं दे रहा, लेकिन learning हो रही है. So maybe if the mother is talking to a child, the child may not immediately speak a word and respond, but suddenly after a week or 10 days, the mother suddenly listens to the child speaking few words or one or two words. That means the child was not acting to be ignorant or dumb and deaf. He was actually synchronizing with the information. He was absorbing all the information. It's just that he showed it much later from the expectation. Cognitive mapping I have already talked about. Then comes the Clark-Hull's drive reduction theory. So Hull believed that, to reduce our drive can help us survive. For that, he wanted to understand this behavior through an experiment done on the rats. Each time the rats were hungry, they kept, running around in the maze and looking for the best and the shortest possible route to reach the food. Why? Hunger was the motivation for the rats to eat the food and overcome hunger. And in this theory, we also talk about the concept of homeostasis. Homeostasis means balance. If there is something too much or too less, functioning becomes difficult. It turns into a malfunctioning. If we are very hungry, we cannot stay like that for long. We want to come back to the normal level where we feel satiated and we don't feel restless and hungry. We don't feel impatient. So, whenever there is an imbalance, we as humans or even other animals run towards balancing it. कम है, डेफिसिट है, तो भी घटी हुई चीज को बढ़ा के नॉर्मल पे लाना, बैलेंस पे लाना। और अगर ज्यादा है, सरप्लस है, तो उसको भी घटा के बैलेंस पे लाना। So when the rats were very hungry, they learned the maze quickly कि भैया कैसे कैसे किन किन दिशाओं से हम जाएं कि फटाफट खाने तक पहुंच जाएं, because they were getting very restless due to the hunger. But if they had just eaten, their motivation dropped. If immediately everything was, provided to them on the platter, they didn't had to hunt for it, they didn't had to struggle for it, immediately the motivation, the drive decreased. And they no longer valued the food. So Hull concluded that learning is strongly influenced by drives and the satisfaction of those drives. That if we are striving for something, we are showing motivation, we are striving to achieve something, it has more of impact on our drives. And even our level of satisfaction is very high if we are striving to fulfill what we have the drive for. हमें बहुत भूख लग रही है और हमें उसके बाद संघर्ष करके बहुत अच्छा खाना मिलता है, we have more of value for that food as compared to when we are sitting on the bed and we are getting everything on the platter. So his concept led to the drive reduction theory, suggesting that behaviors are motivated by the desire to reduce the internal tensions caused by the unmet needs. So whatever internal tensions are happening because of the deprivation of the needs being fulfilled, that increases our drive, our motivation to fulfill those deficit needs. So Hull thought that conditioning and reinforcement can contribute to a better interpretation of human conduct. According to this theory of behavior, the physiological development, imbalance or drives make the person exhibit certain behavior. So drive reduction theory seeks to explain human behavior with a lot of concentration being given to the inner drives, which I've already talked about. And Hull's theory is very similar to the concept of homeostasis. Again, I've talked about that we cannot stay in excess or in deprivation. We need a balance. ज्यादा है तो भी अच्छा नहीं, कम है तो भी अच्छा नहीं. So drive, according to Hull, was the energy produced by the tension. So hunger was a tension, and hunting for the food led that hunting for the food is a motivation or the drive which was led by tension, and and the satiation was the homeostasis after eating the food. So there are two types of drives, primary and secondary drives. Basic needs, primary drives are, for the fulfillment of basic needs. You have read Maslow's needs hierarchy. The basic physiological needs also need to be fulfilled along with higher order needs. So fulfillment of the primary basic needs like food, shelter, safety, procreation, that's the primary drive. Secondary drive is like success, be it through money, be it through fame. All these are the secondary needs. They satisfy our psychological needs more than our physiological needs. Then there are some basic principles of drive reduction theory. First is pre-super institutionalization, which is important order for the behavior to take place in the drive. Then the stimulus has to elicit a response, and for this response to be conditioned, the person must emit it. The first principle is the principle of contiguity, which means that stimulus and reinforcement have to be temporally related. And then the reinforcement is the second principle, which can be regarded as a drive reduction in its basic form. Because whenever we get reinforced, our drive is reduced. हमें जो चाहिए था वो हमें मिल गया, तो उससे हमारा ड्राइव घट जाता है. So this application of behaviorism and new behaviorism can be seen in education to shape the behavior, to help the children develop their personalities, reinforcing the desired behaviors, highlighting the defaulters, or negatively reinforcing the undesired behaviors, punishment. All these are the applications of concepts of behaviorism in education. Same at workplace, receiving salary at the end of the month, being considered as the employee of the month, employee of the year, getting appreciations, getting increments, getting other tokens. All these are the concepts of behaviorism that can be applied in the workplace. It can be applied in therapy, where doing systematic desensitization for overcoming phobia. It is a concept of behavior therapy, and it is coming up from behaviorism only, because in that the client is overcoming phobia by imitating the behavior of the therapist, and the therapist is the model, client is the observer as far as behavior therapy is concerned. Then definitely in parenting also behaviorism is required, because parents end up shaping the behavior of the child at home, teaching what is ethical, what is unethical, what is appreciated, what is criticized. All these parents can apply in developing favorable habits of the child, in shaping personality of the child. Then comes in criminal justice, where the criminal behaviors are negatively reinforced to reduce the crime, and modification of habits by giving reinforcements, positive reinforcements. So behaviorism can also be, applied in these days, artificial intelligence. All the AI is application of behaviorism, if we see. And information, now in behaviorism also we require cognition. Just imitating is not enough. Just comprehending that what is reinforcement, when to get reinforcement, that is not enough. We require the basic mental processes also, like cognition, attention, thinking, problem solving, to understand that how should we acquire a positive reinforcement. हम ऐसा क्या करें जिसके वजह से हमें पॉजिटिव reinforcement मिल पाए. सो उसमें हमें कॉग्निशन की जरूरत पड़ती है, मेंटल प्रोसेसेस की जरूरत पड़ती है, इंफॉर्मेशन प्रोसेसिंग की जरूरत पड़ती है. So behaviorism focuses on observable behavior, which we have been studying since the beginning of the chapter. And all these are already covered in the beginning of the chapter. And connections between information processing and behaviorism is very important. So learning mechanisms, behaviorism can explain how external stimuli can lead to learning and behavioral changes. So it can be applied in various work settings that we have already seen. It can be applied in systematic desensitization, therapy, workplace, education, criminal justice. And cognitive interpretation can be used for attention. It can be used in perception. Cognitive mapping we already talked about. Response we have talked about. Now, this is important, complex learning tasks. So when behaviorist study learning in the context of behavior chains, information processing helps to understand how each step is processed cognitively. मतलब अगर हम information processing को समझते हैं, हमें ये जानना बहुत जरूरी है कि हमने कैसे उस information को समझा, comprehend किया, कैसे उसको हमने process किया. Then comes the rule-based behavior. It can be expanded by incorporating information processing principles to explain rule-based learning. Means whatever we have to learn, that has to be within the frame of the rules. We can't go against the ethics to learn a behavior. So information processing helps to to understand the details of how we have to learn as per the rules. Feedback and loop behavior change. We show a behavior, we get the feedback, we incorporate the feedback, again we show the behavior. It becomes a cyclic process. And there could be internal feedback as well as external feedback. Internal feedback is your introspection, कि मुझे कोई behavior दिखा के कैसा लगा, मैं अपने आप को जज करता हूँ, मैं अपने आप को रेट करता हूँ कि इस this is the performance of my behavior and this is the level of satisfaction that I got by showing a certain behavior. Whereas external feedback is the feedback given by the other experts who are observing you. So we have finished half the syllabus in the session that was scheduled between 11 to 1:30, and now in the next half, which is scheduled between 2:30 to 5, we will be catering to the leftover syllabus. We will be looking into the previous year questions, and I will be taking up the queries of those students who must have penned down their queries by now, and those who had left the meeting in between can join back to ask their queries related to the syllabus. Previous year question I will be showing you. So next class starts at 2. So it starts at 2:30 after 1 hour. So there is a break of 1 hour. The first class was from 11 to 1:30. Now after 1 hour at 2:30, the second session starts, which will be till 5 p.m. So I'm looking forward to see all of you back after 1 hour. Thank you.